At dawn, campers saw a flicker of red on a sheer granite ledge, Evan Palmer's emergency tarp signaling life 22 days after he vanished into the High Sierra. With a shattered ankle and a mind fraying, he clung to hope as the mountain waited. The mid-August sun had barely cleared the rooftops of Sacramento when Evan Palmer eased the front door closed behind him, backpack slung low across his broad shoulders. Inside, the kitchen lights glowed soft and warm, and the scent of coffee lingered in the air. He paused at the threshold, turning back to his sister, Jess, who stood by the island counter with her phone tucked between shoulder and ear, already fielding worried texts. 6 days, he reminded her, voice gentle but certain. Just 6 days to clear my head and bag Cathedral Peak. I'll call every other night. He offered a grin that carried both excitement and reassurance. Jess folded her arms, tilting her head. You said that last trip, too, she teased lightly, though her smile trembled at the corners. Make sure you check in, okay? I'll have my phone logged on standby. She pressed a hand to the stainless steel fridge where postcards and a half-written journal entry clung beneath magnets. I've got a feeling you'll find what you're looking for up there. Evan stepped forward, brushing a kiss to her temple. In that quiet moment, the hum of city life felt distant, an apt prologue to the wilderness that awaited. He reached into his pack, pulling out a folded weather report clipped from the ranger station's website the night before. Highs in the mid-70s, but unexpected snowmelt warning around Dusy Basin, he read, voice soft. They say stream crossings could be tricky, but I've handled worse. He snapped the paper closed, tucking it into a mesh pocket. Outside, the August heat rose already, promising dry trails and sun-baked granite. Evan slung his pack on again, hefting its weight with practiced ease. He planted his hiking poles by the door. They'd been a last-minute addition, but he trusted their support more than his own 2 good feet. Jess fell into step as they walked to the car, the morning quiet cloaking them. Across the driveway, their neighbor's wind chimes caught a faint breeze, tinkling in a gentle rhythm. It felt oddly poetic. A farewell song drifting away on a breeze too light for August. He lifted his hand in salute as Jess rounded the corner to wave from the sidewalk. In that look between them, decades of shared memories passed, childhood camping trips, late-night talks under a tent fly, the time she helped him nurse a twisted ankle after he'd slipped on a river crossing. She'd been his anchor then, just as he tried to anchor her now. Engine rumbling, Evan eased backward down the driveway. Jess stayed at the curb until the taillights turned into a blur, shoulders squared against the weight of unsaid prayers. Behind him, the house faded into the morning haze, swallowed by the promise of wilderness and the unspoken truth that once he passed the ranger station, no one could reach him but himself. And so, under a sky already burning gold, Evan Palmer set out toward solitude, and toward a mountain no one else aimed to climb. The forest waited, silent and patient, its secrets tucked between ridges yet to reveal themselves. Evan Palmer tightened the straps of his pack beneath the muted hum of the ranger station radio. A thin haze of diesel and pine clung to the air as he stepped onto the dusty trailhead, boots landing on damp earth warmed by an August sun. The morning felt electric, every breath laced with promise and the faint tang of snowmelt trickling somewhere high above. He paused beside the logbook kiosk, where dozens of scrawled names trailed down the pages like pilgrims seeking solace. With deliberate care, Evan signed his name beneath the date, August 23, 2005. He noted his intended route, Dusy Basin to the southern ridge of Venaker Needle, and the projected 6-day timeline. Rangers hovering nearby offered a polite nod, their eyes briefly meeting his with the respectful distance owed to a self-sufficient hiker. Before he stepped away, he unzipped the mesh pocket on his hip belt and withdrew a small spiral-bound journal. Its pages were already peppered with shorthand entries. Sunrise at 6:07 a.m. First creek sighting at mile 1.2. Water level moderate. Today's page he left blank, promising to record each hour's progress. He clicked his pen, its black ink gleaming in the sun, and tucked it back into its sheath. The first miles led him through lodgepole pines, standing sentinel along a narrow ribbon of trail. Early on, he crossed the South Fork of the San Joaquin River on a slick granite slab, pausing to scoop icy water into his Nalgene's. He drank deeply, the cold shock drawing a low whistle from his lips. Up ahead, thin wisps of cloud hugged the mountain flanks, casting shifting shadows across granite faces that rose in sheer walls. At midday, Evan settled on a boulder overlooking a meadow of tiger lilies and paintbrush. He unrolled his map on one knee and marked his current position with a quick X. From this vantage, the route ahead seemed to curl like a silver snake, threading between steep ridges and hidden gullies. He flipped open his satellite phone, pressed the call button, and waited for the crackle of connection. Jessie's voice came crisp and warm, carrying her relief at hearing him. He spoke for only 5 minutes, enough to reassure her he was well and that he'd check in again in 48 hours. The afternoon sun climbed higher and the air grew thinner. Evan felt a familiar ache in his lungs as he gained elevation, each step a careful negotiation. He paused to tighten his gaiters against a marshy section where snowmelt had carved miniature streams. In that moment, he felt the full weight of the wilderness settle around him. The ancient pines, the distant cry of a Clark's nutcracker, the promise of solitude, both thrilling and humbling. By late afternoon, he reached a granite rib overlooking Dusy Basin. He unfastened his pack to retrieve lunch, a simple spread of tortillas, pepper jack, and dried apricots, then leaned back against the stone. With the basin's alpine lake glinting below, he penned his first full journal entry. Day 1, trail conditions excellent. Weather mild. Spirits high. Basin still frozen patches at 10,200 feet. Summit within reach. As the sun dipped toward the western ridges, Evans stowed his map and journal, shouldered his pack once more, and continued into the silence. Ahead lay the unmarked switchbacks, where the forest would thin and the real test begin. Yet in that golden hour, buoyed by routine and resolve, every possibility felt within reach. By the second morning, the forest's cathedral hush had been replaced by the rasp of pine needles under Evan's boots and the steady thrum of his own breath. He left camp before dawn, headlamp beam cutting a narrow path through fir and hemlock. As light spilled over the ridge, the trail dissolved into a maze of fallen logs and loose scree. No cairns, no cut marks, only faint depressions in the earth that hinted at a route. Evan paused on a narrow ledge, peering at the steep slope below. His map showed a switchback here, but the angle made it impossible to discern more than a jagged gray wall streaked with snowmelt rivulets. He set his poles and tested the first handhold, a weathered granite outcrop that barely bore his weight. His heart thrummed as adrenaline edged in. One wrong move would send him tumbling hundreds of feet. Step by cautious step, he descended into the heart of the ridge. Each switchback was a new puzzle, a hidden notch carved by centuries of thaw-freeze cycles, a moss-slick slab sloping into shadow, a cluster of talus boulders teetering on an invisible fulcrum. He fixed his gaze on the next landmark, a lone Jeffrey pine clinging to a rocky outcrop like a desperate sentinel. Trusting the tree's tenacity, he navigated toward it, hands scrabbling for purchase in crevices no thicker than a thumbnail. The sun rose higher, and Evan felt sweat prick at his temples despite the thin air. He hunted for the tiny stream the map had promised. His water bottles were still half full, but he'd learned in past hikes that alpine trickles could vanish without warning. When he found the watercourse, It was a whisper of melt beneath a snow bridge. He filled his bottles with trembling fingers and paused to sip, each mouthful tasting of stone and sky. Pushing forward, he felt a surge of pride at mastering each obstacle. He thought of his childhood rock-climbing lessons with his father, recalling the elder Palmer's steady voice guiding him over granite walls. That memory buoyed him as he climbed a steep gully, muscles burning, lungs burning hotter. A gust of wind rattled loose stones above, and he froze, mind flashing back to those early climbs when fear was a lesson, not a threat. Then came the slip. One foot on a loose pebble, the other searching for purchase. Suddenly, gravity yanked him earthward. His poles skittered down the slope as he pitched sideways. He braced with his left arm against the rock, shoulder jarring on impact. Pain flared, but he rolled against the granite, somehow arresting his fall. Heart pounding, he lay still for a long moment, listening to the wind and the steady drip of melting snow. Gingerly, he tested his arm and ankle. Both ached fiercely, but he could still stand. He sat on a flat boulder to regain composure, breathing deep until the racing in his chest slowed. Scratched but determined, he surveyed the next stretch of ridge. There were no signs of danger hidden beyond this, just more ridges, more switchbacks, and the promise of an unnamed summit. When he rose again, each step was measured, reverent almost. The terrain had spoken its warning, and Evan heard it clearly. Yet he pressed on, driven by the clarity he sought among these granite heights, and the conviction that every hardship carried him closer to something he couldn't yet name, something that waited above the forest's edge. Day 3 dawned under a steely sky that hinted at shifting weather. Evan Palmer crept from his bivouac before sunrise, the mylar tarp tucked neatly beneath his pack as a silent witness to last night's frost. A thin veil of mist clung to the tree trunks, and every breath boiled in the cold air. He paused on a ridge crest to scan the horizon, granite peaks framed by low clouds that scuttled like restless spirits. He flipped open his satellite phone and dialed Jess's number without hesitation, a ritual of reassurance he clung to since childhood. The line crackled to life, her familiar warmth flowing through the earpiece. He spoke of the unmarked switchbacks, of bruised ribs from his tumble, and of the basin's crescent lake glinting below. But before he could share his plan to push higher, static roared through his words. Her voice, once clear, wavered, then cut out completely, replaced by an electronic hiss. Evan's heart tightened as he pressed the phone to the sky, searching for a signal that vanished like smoke. He stared at the blank screen, the unease he'd pushed aside creeping back in. Back in Sacramento, Jess would be growing anxious with every minute of silence. He remembered her steady hand on his arm after he'd twisted his ankle last spring on the Tuolumne River Trail. How she'd urged him to rest, to wait for help. That memory, sweet and soft, contrasted sharply with the biting wind that now assaulted his cheeks. Despite the chill, Evan filled his water bottles at a nearby snowmelt stream, every drop a lifeline. He paused to examine the dark clouds gathering above the southern ridges, noting how quickly they swelled into a low, brooding blanket. The ranger's warning about early snowmelt seemed prophetic now. A sudden gust rattled loose pebbles down the slope, and a cold prickle raced down his spine. He closed his eyes and drew on an old mantra his father had taught him. Mountains demand respect, but they reward resolve. He pictured his father's calm face, guiding him over rock faces, reminding him that every climber carries both fear and courage in equal measure. Steeling himself, Evan slipped the phone into his jacket and set his jaw. Pressing onward, he navigated a series of narrow ledges carved by melting snow, each step deliberate. As the wind sharpened into a howl, he crept beneath a fractured overhang to rest, wrapping his torso in the foil-like warmth of his mylar emergency blanket. His fingers trembled as he replaced his journal beneath his thigh, ready to record each twist of weather and tide of emotion. Though the silence of the wilderness felt oppressive, Evan welcomed its clarity. No traffic noise, no demands, only the raw dialogue between man and mountain. He weighed his options. Descending to wait out the storm risked losing altitude he'd earned. Pressing up risked deeper snow and isolation. With a final glance at the roiling sky, he chose to ascend, trusting that the high ground offered the best chance for visibility and rescue. Each breath grew shallower as he climbed higher into the looming clouds. The satellite phone lay silent in his pack, but Evan pushed on, driven by an unspoken promise to Jess, and by the conviction that, even as signals faded, his own resolve would never waver. Late morning light filtered through churning clouds as Evan Palmer crested a narrow saddle, each breath sharp against the thin air. His calves burned from the steady climb, and he paused to tighten his gaiters against the gritty snowmelt patches. Below him, a hidden ledge shimmered, a pocket of packed snow stained with dust from the rocky overhang above. He'd eyed it for hours, a shortcut that shaved precious elevation from his route. The promise of progress urged him onward. He tested the first foothold, solid granite under a veneer of powdered snow, and eased his weight forward. Gravel cascaded beneath his boot, but the stone held. With the pack's full weight pressing down, he shifted his poles to the opposite hand. The wind gusted, rattling loose stones above like warning bells. Evan inhaled, recalling his father's voice echoing in his mind. Always feel the rock, not the step. Steady, careful. He edged across the ledge, every sinew tuned to balance. The basin glowed far below, a sapphire mirror reflecting a sky bruised by storm. He pictured Jess waiting for his call, her reassuring smile anchoring him even here. Yet as he reached the midpoint, the granite beneath his left boot gave way in a powder of loose shale. Gravity seized him. In slow terror, he felt his right ankle roll and snap against the unforgiving stone. A crack rang sharp, silencing the wind. Pain bloomed like wildfire, scorching his nerves. He pitched forward, arms flailing for purchase that never came. The world spun as he tumbled, first rock, then air, until his body slammed against a protruding granite chunk, jolting his vision into white-hot agony. Evan lay crumpled on the dusty ledge, his pack wedged beneath him. Stars of pain pulsed behind his eyes as he fought for breath. His right ankle throbbed in a rhythm synced to his heartbeat, each pulse a reminder of bone grinding on stone. He tasted copper, blood on his tongue, from a shallow cut on his lip. For a heartbeat, the mountain seemed indifferent, its silent expanse feeding off his weakness. Panic fluttered at the edges of his mind. Alone. Far from any ranger station. He tried to move, but the jolt sent a fresh wave of pain crashing through him. Tears blurred his vision as he realized the gravity of his injury. A broken ankle here meant immobility, and immobility in the High Sierra could be fatal. Yet beneath the fear, a pulse of determination took root. He crawled forward on hands and good knee until he could lie flat against the ledge. He unbuckled his pack belt, dragging it free, and wrapped the straps around his ankle in a makeshift splint. Each tug sent white-hot sparks through the joint, but he pressed on until the bind felt taut and secure. In that tense silence, Evan reached for his mylar tarp, his lifeline against the mountain's cruelty. He shook it free, the metallized foil snapping open like a second skin. He draped half over himself, the other half he folded into a bright square. Fingers trembling, he tucked it into his pack's outer mesh, envisioning how the sun might catch its crimson underside as a signal. His breathing slowed, each inhale measured against the dull roar of pain. He pressed the satellite phone to his ear, but the screen remained black, a dead weight sealed against hope. He sank against the granite, head bowed, letting the crestfall of emotion break him in quiet sobs. As the wind tugged at the tarp's edges, Evan whispered into the emptiness, "I'm not done yet." Above him the clouds thinned for a moment, and a shaft of sun illuminated the basin below. It was a fleeting promise, a reminder that despite the fall and the fracture, he still stood in a world where rescue was possible. Gathering his will, he folded the tarp's signal corner over his pack strap so that, if fate and sun aligned, someone might see the flash of red and know he was still alive. Dusk settled like a velvet cloak as Evan Palmer inched himself away from the shattered ledge, each movement a negotiation between pain and will. He crawled on hands and good knee, the mylar tarp half draped over his shoulders, its metallic surface catching the last rays of a reluctant sun. Below him, Dusy Basin lay cloaked in shadow, its sapphire water darkening with the hour. The mountain's roar softened to a low murmur, the wind slipping through granite cracks, the drip of melting snow somewhere out of sight. He aimed for a fractured cleft a dozen yards ahead, a narrow alcove tucked beneath a granite overhang. There, rock shelves promised a modicum of shelter against the night's cold. Every inch toward it seared with agony, but Evan focused on the rhythm of his breathing, willing his body to cooperate. When at last he wriggled into the cleft, he pressed his back to the stone, chest heaving, tears dampening the mylar's sheen. He closed his eyes and allowed memory to carry him elsewhere. He was 9 again, perched on a mossy log beside a mountain stream in Yosemite. His father knelt beside him, teaching how to read water flow and choose the safest crossing stones. "Trust your instincts, but always test the ground," his father had said, voice calm as water. Younger Evan had dipped his hand into the current, watching reflections twist in silver ripples. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," his father whispered. "It's moving forward despite it." The words had stuck in his heart like mountain lichen to rock. Back in reality, the wind sharpened and cold prickled Evan's skin. He gathered the mylar tarp and spread it beneath him as an insulative layer, its crinkled surface glowing ghostly gold in the fading light. From his pack he withdrew a lightweight foam pad, his last luxury, and curled onto it, drawing knees to chest. The broken ankle throbbed in protest, but he eased it onto the pad, careful not to twist the makeshift splint. He ripped the remaining tarp into a smaller square and draped it over his torso like a blanket. The foil hissed softly as it adjusted to the rocky contours, trapping the heat exhaled by his breath. He drew his jacket hood over his head, cheeks flushed with shock and exhaustion. His fingers fumbled for the insulated mug stashed beside him. Inside lay a few gulps of lukewarm electrolyte drink. Each swallow burned with gratitude and desperation. Silence filled the alcove, broken only by the rasp of his own breath and the distant howl of a draft between granite teeth. He uncurled long enough to open his journal, pen poised above the page. With trembling strokes he wrote, "Night 1. Sheltered in cleft at 11,200 feet. Ankle splinted. Temperatures falling. Tarp saved me. Must ration water and energy. Hold on." He paused, eyes drawn to the mylar's shimmer under starlight. It had become more than a blanket. It was a signal, a promise that he refused to vanish. Somewhere far below, search teams had called off the hunt. Somewhere back home, Jess sat waiting, her faith treading the same thin line between hope and despair. A chill breeze rattled stones overhead. Evan tucked the journal into his jacket, closed his eyes, and whispered into the darkness, "I'll make it." The echo of his voice melded with the mountain's breath, and in that fragile moment, the memory of his father's words steadied him. Courage was moving forward. He let the mantra carry him into a fitful sleep, mind drifting between dreams of granite walls and childhood streams, anchored by the promise that dawn would come, and with it, another chance to survive. Dawn arrived as a pale wash of light across the granite walls, but it offered little warmth. Evan Palmer cracked open one eye to the hiss of cold air against his mylar shelter. Every muscle protested when he attempted to shift, the makeshift splint biting into his swollen ankle. He swallowed a sharp protest, reminding himself that pain was a sign of life, and that he was still here to feel it. He eased himself upright, bracing on his good knee and one trembling hand until he could reach his water bottles. The electrolyte drink had dwindled overnight. He prized each swallow as though it were liquid gold. Beyond the alcove, the high-altitude sun had burned away the last wisps of mist, revealing the basin's frozen patches draped in stark white. He refilled one bottle at a trickle of snowmelt dripping over a mossy stone, a slow, precious drip that echoed in his ears. With water secured, Evan unfolded the journal to note the time, 6:42 a.m., and record his dwindling supplies. He traced a finger over the hastily drawn map in his mind. The ridge above him, the steep talus slopes he'd need to navigate, and the line of small switchbacks carved by an earlier ranger patrol. If he could reach those switchbacks, he might catch a helicopter's eye. So he leaned on his poles, one in each hand now, bearing half his weight through aching shoulders to stand. Each step was a gamble. Loose gravel skittered beneath his boots as he inched forward, his gaze fixed on the next stable rock. His right leg, splinted and throbbing, offered little support. His left carried the bulk of his weight. With each grueling shift, sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the chill. Yet dehydration, not cold, was now his greatest threat. He tasted dryness at the back of his throat, and his focus wavered as his brain cried out for more water. Above him, the roar of rotors sliced through the crisp air. Evan lifted his head, heart pounding with hope and dread. A USGS chopper wheeled across the basin, its searchlight sweeping like a slow, mechanical eye. He raised an arm, the mylar tarp's crimson underside fluttering like a wounded flag. 2 beats of his heart later, the helicopter banked away, without dipping the long lens toward his ledge. The pilot, scanning below, saw only blank granite. A wave of despair washed over him, but it was tempered by the iron edge of resolve. He would not let that missed moment be his undoing. Gingerly, he pressed forward until he emerged onto the first switchback, where the slope leveled just enough for him to rest. He sank onto a sun-warmed boulder, pulled from his pack a single energy bar, and tore it open with shaking fingers. Each bite was gritty with sand and sweat, but it fueled him. As the sun climbed, he marked time by the shadows shifting across the ridge. He sipped water until the bottle was nearly empty, clicking the cap closed and tucking it away. In his journal he wrote, Day 4. Water critical but holding. Helicopter overhead. Missed it. Must signal from higher point. Mental clarity slipping. Will push to ridge. He closed the cover, staring west at the jagged skyline. The mountain was indifferent to his plight, but Evan felt a fierce bond to its silent grandeur. He tested his ankle with a slow shift of weight, breathed deep, and rose. Every ounce of pain, every drop of water drained. And every missed signal only sharpened his determination. Ahead lay higher ground, and with it his only hope. Driven by fear and fueled by stubborn will, he crawled forward into the day's harsh light. By the 5th day, Evan Palmer's world had narrowed to the broken ankle at his side, the relentless sun overhead, and the icy drip of snowmelt at his feet. Each dawn he rose on the razor's edge between hope and despair, but today resolve flared brighter than fear. He needed a signal bold enough to pierce the mountain's indifference. He unpacked the remaining scrap of his emergency tarp, a half square of crimson nylon, its silver mylar backing long folded away. His fingers trembled as he tied one corner to a jagged pine branch, the fabric snapping like a banner in the stiff breeze. The makeshift flagpole quivered against the sky, but when he shook the branch, the red sheet unfurled in a brilliant bloom of color. He planted the branch into a crack on the ledge, angling the flagpole toward the basin's open sweep. Below, the alpine lake glittered, a distant mirror reflecting sunlight back at him. Evan stood at the edge, breathing deep, convinced that a rescue helicopter would spot this signal. For a fleeting moment, he believed the mountain might heed his call. But hours passed without a hum of rotors. The sun dipped low, and the temperature plummeted. Evan's throat burned with thirst, his thoughts keening at the edges. He crawled back to the cleft where he had sheltered his first night and retrieved a coiled segment of orange cord from his pack. Another beacon if fate wavered on red alone. He tied loops and knots, fashioning a spiral of bright cord he could fling onto the rocks below, hoping the bright coils would catch a searcher's eye. As twilight gathered, Evan's mind began to fray. Shadows lengthened into looming shapes, and he caught himself murmuring responses to questions no one asked. Between coughs brought on by the cold, he envisioned Jess pacing their kitchen floor, phone pressed to her ear, waiting for any word. Guilt knotted in his chest. He'd failed her promise to check in. He'd failed himself. When darkness fell, he sank against the granite, heart pounding with imagined rotors and unseen eyes. In the wavering beam of his headlamp, the red fabric took on a life of its own, tendrils of crimson twisting like serpents around the branch. He blinked and the shapes retreated, but the doubt remained. What if no one ever saw him? Cold seeped through his layers. He wrapped himself in the foil-thin mylar blanket and closed his eyes, searching memory for solace. In that haze, he heard his father's voice again. When you're lost, make noise. When you're silent, you give up. The words stung like ice. He would not be silent. With renewed urgency, Evan crawled back outside. He hauled the red flagpole to firmer ground, repositioned the knots of orange cord like a streamer, and scraped bright gashes into the granite with the tip of his trekking pole. 3 deep strikes in the shape of an SOS. Each scrape rang hollow in the cold air, a desperate tattoo on the mountain's skin. As the final echo faded, Evan pressed his palm against the rock, whispering into the darkness, "I'm still here." The wind caught the cord in a sudden gust, snapping it taut and making the red flag flutter like a heartbeat. Alone beneath the indifferent stars, he lay back against the stone and watched that fluttering signal, clinging to the hope that tomorrow someone, anyone, would answer his call. At a picnic table strewn with photocopied flyers, Jess Palmer folded her phone screen into the morning light, her reflection fractured against the laminated surface. The kitchen in her Sacramento home had become command central. Half-empty boxes of paper pinned with Evan's photo, maps of the High Sierra tacked to the walls, and a whiteboard scrawled with search updates. A mug of cooling coffee sat untouched at her elbow, its steam long since vanished. Her best friend, Marisol, hovered beside her, dipping biscuits into a fresh pot. "They're printing another 100 flyers," Marisol said, waving a sheet with Evan's smiling face. "And the account for the private search fund topped $2,000 last night." Jess managed a shaky smile, the weight in her chest a dull ache she could neither ignore nor soothe. 2 days had passed since the official search was scaled back. Every sunrise brought the same hollow space where Evan's voice should have been on her answering machine. In her mind, she replayed their last phone call, the live wire of his excitement as he described cathedral walls of granite, the sudden crackle before. All went silent. That static line haunted her, an unanswered question screaming for resolution. She tapped the board beside her, where ranger bulletins warned of treacherous switchbacks, early snowmelt, and dwindling daylight. The Park Service had ceased foot patrols 4 days ago and canceled aerial sweeps after finding no sign. Jess's frustration had ballooned into resolve. If the rangers could not find him, she would hire guides, fund searches, and keep every light in the dark on until someone spotted her brother. Outside, the late summer sun climbed, gilding the front yard's hydrangeas. Jess rifled through her bag for a stack of flyers and headed out to post them along neighborhood bulletin boards, grocery stores, community centers, the local climbing gym where Evan had trained. Each time she stuck a flyer under attack, her chest constricted, breath catching on the swirl of his wide-eyed grin. It felt both comforting and cruel, a reminder of the brother she knew and the brother she feared she'd lost. Back at home, the phone rang yet again. Jess dashed back, nearly tripping over the threshold. Marisol lifted the receiver. "Ranger Station," she announced, voice steady. Jess pressed close, heart thundering. The dispatcher's tone was sympathetic but formal. No new sightings, no overdue satellite pings, no breakthroughs. Jess's hands clenched the edge of the counter, nails whitening. She exhaled so hard her shoulders shook. That afternoon, she organized a press release with Marisol's help. A local news crew arrived, a camera light glaring too bright, illuminating the fatigue etched into Jess's face. She read the words she never imagined saying on television. "My brother Evan is missing in the High Sierra. If anyone has any information, please contact." Behind her, a map of Dusy Basin served as a silent plea. As the crew packed up, Jess lingered, tracing the basin's contour with her finger. She closed her eyes and summoned a memory of Evan on their last shared hike. Him pointing out a flicker of elusive deer in the pines, his laugh warm as summer air. The memory crackled with life. Opening her eyes, she drew in a shuddering breath and whispered, "I won't stop until you're home." Night fell on the house, and the glow of her laptop illuminated new donations pouring in. Jess leaned back, exhaustion pulling at her bones, but her resolve remained unbroken. Outside, the world slipped into dark, and somewhere, far above in the High Sierra's cold air, Evan would need every ounce of that hope she guarded so fiercely. A low rumble in the sky awakened Evan Palmer before dawn. He cracked open one eye to find the world beyond his cleft bathed in an ashen light, clouds roiling like a storm-tossed sea. The air felt heavier, charged with electric threat. He pressed a hand to his chest, listening as his heartbeat drummed against the mylar shelter that cocooned him. It rattled in the wind, a fragile shield against the mountain's gathering fury. Shivering, Evan forced himself erect and reached for the journal tucked beside him. His pen froze over the page as sprinkles of snow sifted through the rocky overhang. The flakes were soft at first, then driven by gusts into stinging shards that bit his exposed cheek. He snapped the tarp closed around himself and pressed his forehead against cool foil, willing calm into his racing mind. A flash of memory stirred. Evan, at 8 years old, standing with his father beneath a sudden summer storm in Tahoe. They'd huddled beneath a pine, boots sinking into wet needles as thunder rolled overhead. His father's steady hand had gripped his shoulder. "Storms test you," he'd said. "They reveal what you're made of." Younger Evan had felt safe in that lesson, shielded by experience and a parent's faith. Now, alone and broken, Evan drew on that borrowed courage, steadying his breath against the storm's howl. He cinched down his pack straps and crawled from the cleft into wind-driven snow. Each movement sliced into his ankle, but adrenaline lent him stubborn strength. He planted his poles into the hardening ground and began the crawl toward a nearby overhang he'd spotted the day before. The ledges were slick with ice. His pole slipped, and he lurched forward, slapping one hand against rock to stay upright. Pain flared, hot and white, but he stacked his limbs in careful dawn in Dusy Basin, rose like a pale promise, the sky's lavender fingers teasing the granite peaks. The weekend camping party stirred in their slumbering bags, yawns and rustling nylon mingling with the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines. They had pitched their tent on a gentle slope 1/2 mile from the sheer cliff drop, the very precipice where the valley fell away into jagged silence. Frost clung to tent flaps as they unzipped into the chill. Mara, the first light in her cup of coffee, lifted her binoculars to the far horizon. She was scanning ridge lines for high-altitude deer, her mind drifting over work emails and forgotten to-do lists. Beside her, Luis twisted to shake out his stiff shoulders, inhaling the mountain air heavy with pine resin and damp earth. The others, Tina and Scott, stayed cocooned in their sleeping bags, voices still threaded with dreams. Mara trained the lenses over the rocky ledges, her breath pluming in soft clouds. She frowned. Something below caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of sunrise light, a quartz vein glinting red in the gold. But the color held, vivid against the gray granite, red, like fabric fluttering. Her heart thumped, and she nudged Luis. "Look down there," she whispered, voice hushed as if the mountain might overhear. He swapped places, adjusting the focus, and there it was, a flicker of crimson nestled on a narrow shelf, almost hidden in shadow. It rippled, as if moved by a breath of wind. Luis swallowed. "Signal? Tarp?" His voice trembled. He ducked back to the tent and hauled out his satellite phone. Fingers shaking, he dialed the ranger station's emergency line, each ring echoing harshly against the silent peaks. Mara kept her binoculars fixed on the spot, willing the red cloth to stay visible. Within minutes, that felt like hours, Scott emerged, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Tina fumbled for her jacket. The four clustered around Luis's phone, voices low but urgent as he spoke. "Yes, campers. Latitude 1, mile west of Dusy Basin trailhead. I'm seeing red fabric on a ledge. It might be a signal." The call ended. A hush fell over them. No one spoke until Mara lowered her binoculars, lips trembling. "Someone's up there." Luis exhaled. "And they need help." Together they broke camp in a flurry of activity, tearing down tents, stowing packs, voices quick with adrenaline. Every rustle of gear sounded deafening in the quiet dawn. They navigated down the winding trail toward the cliff's edge, the air growing colder as they descended into the rocky cleft. Moss-draped boulders and splintered pines loomed overhead. The red flash remained in sight, defiant, hopeful. As they neared the drop-off, the shape of a human figure emerged, curled and still, a crumpled form draped in red tarp. Mara's breath hitched. Beneath the tarp, limbs lay impossibly thin, bone-etched. Scott stifled a gasp. Tina covered her mouth. Luis crouched, placing a wand on the victim's shoulder, gentle though his palm shook. The figure didn't stir. Mara shouted toward the distant hum of a rescue helicopter already en route, its rotor wash stirring dust into spirals. She saw the victim's head shift, eyelids fluttering. In that moment, the campers understood. They had found him. Evan Palmer, the solitary hiker lost to these unforgiving heights, and now his fight for life had another chance. The rotor blades of the helicopter chopped through the silent canyon as the ranger team prepared on the cliff's rim. Dawn had given way to pale morning light, casting long shadows across the granite face. Sergeant Dalton leaned over the edge, knotting his gloves tighter, eyes fixed on the ledge below. Beside him, Deputy Wallace checked the rappel line, the metal carabiners glinting dully. Each man's breath puffed in clouds, the air already thin from altitude. "Rigs set," Wallace murmured. Dalton nodded, scanning the rocky shelf where the red tarp lay draped over something or someone. He signaled to the pilot, and the helicopter eased back, rotor wash sending pebbles skittering toward the abyss. Dalton clipped in, double-checked his harness, then stepped off the edge and into free space. The world shifted as he descended, a dizzying drop punctuated by the roar of wind. Below, Evan Palmer lay curled in the fetal position, the red mylar blanket twisted around his shoulders. His skin was sunburned scarlet, his breathing ragged. When Dalton's gloved boots touched the rock beside him, Evan's head lolled toward the handler as if by gravity alone. Dalton knelt, voice low but urgent. "Evan? I'm Sergeant Dalton with the National Park Service. You're safe now." Evan's eyes flickered open, pupils dilated, sweat streaking his hollow cheeks. He tried to speak, but his throat rasped. Dalton removed the blanket and eased water past Evan's cracked lips. "Just breathe, buddy. We've got you." He ripped open his own emergency kit, wrapping Evan's twisted ankle in a rigid splint and pressing a sterile pad to a bleeding scrape on his forearm. Up above, the other rangers watched the descent, ropes snaking over the cliff like coiled serpents. When Dalton signaled "ready," they began hauling him and Evan upward in tandem. The climb was agonizingly slow, each foot planted, each pull on the rope requiring gritted teeth. Evan slipped in and out of consciousness, murmuring disconnected fragments. Cold nights, the echo of distant helicopters, the constant whisper of fear. By the time they reached the rim, the helicopter had returned, rotor wash mingling with cheers from the ground crew. Dalton helped lift Evan onto the stretcher, his body limp but alive. The medic knelt, checking vitals, securing oxygen. Evan's pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. Miles away at the park's backcountry headquarters, Jess Palmer sat frozen in the makeshift waiting room. She had arrived hours earlier, summoned when the campers reported the signal. Now her hands trembled around a paper cup of coffee, her knuckles white. A clerk approached, voice soft and careful. "Ms. Palmer, it's Sergeant Dalton, Evan's stable. They're bringing him in now." Jess's breath caught, chest tightening as if the words had clawed their way into her lungs. She dropped the cup, the coffee sloshing across the floor, and hurried through the doorway. In the helicopter's landing zone, she saw him. Evan, gaunt and bandaged, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids. His once broad shoulders were sunken, and every breath seemed a struggle. Yet he was here. As the stretcher touched solid ground, Jess rushed forward, tears springing free. Dalton gently transferred Evan into her arms. She felt the ragged rise of his chest against her shoulder, the faint warmth of life beneath her trembling hands. "Oh, Evan," she whispered, voice breaking. "You came back." Evan's fingers twitched around her wrist. In that moment, the weight of his ordeal, the endless nights, the solitary terror, began to lift. Against the endless gray of the high Sierra cliff, the bond between them shone brighter than any signal tarp could ever be. Jess stood in the sterile whiteness of Meadowbrook Hospital's intensive care unit. Her fingers curled around the guardrail of Evan's bed. The steady beep of the heart monitor pulsed like a metronome marking the rhythm of his tenuous recovery. Sunlight slanted through the blinds, carving pale stripes across his bandaged torso and the thin blanket that barely concealed the bruises and scrapes he'd sustained. Each breath he took was a victory, and a reminder of how close the mountains had come to claiming him. In the days that followed, Evan drifted between fevered dreams and waking moments of disorientation. Jess read aloud from their favorite travel journals, her voice wavering as she described sunrises in Peru and forest trails in Appalachia they'd once explored together. Sometimes Evan's eyelids fluttered. Sometimes his hand would curl around hers before slipping back to stillness. Jess slept in the recliner by his bedside, logs of her tears drying on the hospital pamphlets beneath her pillow. Physical therapy began with the smallest steps. Evan's once sure stride was now a hesitant shuffle, his broken ankle a painful reminder of the ledge where he'd nearly given in. He learned to trust his body again, lifting a weak arm, flexing rigid fingers, each movement a triumph over the scarring inside and out. The mylar tarp, now folded in evidence plastic, hung in his hospital room like a talisman of survival. Its crinkled surface caught the light, reminding him daily that he had been seen and saved. But the hardest battles were fought in the quiet moments, when memories unspooled like film reels against the ceiling. He revisited the shuddering collapse when the cliff gave way beneath him, the icy nights spent shivering until hypothermia blotted the edge of consciousness, and the creeping dread that no search party would find him. In therapy with a counselor, he faced the hollowness that had bloomed in his chest, an emptiness born of isolation and the fear that he had been abandoned by the world he loved. One afternoon, as late winter thaw began to paint the High Sierra streams, Jess presented Evan with a small notebook. "For reflections," she said softly. Inside, he wrote of gratitude and remorse, of the solace he'd found in the star-scoured sky and the lessons etched into every scar. He penned a letter to the campers whose eyes had spotted the flash of red, thanking them for their courage and calm, and to the rangers who rappelled into the unknown to reach him. When he was finally discharged, the first breath of mountain air felt like baptism. His steps on the hospital lawn were unsteady, but each one rang with purpose. Jess wheeled the pink tarp between them, a bridge between death and life. Together they drove back to the trailhead at Dusy Basin, laying a small memorial of wildflowers and a GPS beacon in honor of the lost and found. A year later, Jess stood at the head of a circle of hikers, rangers, and campers gathered at the trailhead. The Flash of Red Safety Workshop bore Evan's name, a tribute to his ordeal and a pledge to future adventurers. Maps were unfolded, gear checks demonstrated, satellite phone protocols explained. Above them, the peaks loomed silent and watchful. Evan, leaner and steadier, took the microphone last. His voice was clear, resonant with empathy. "Solitude can heal," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon, "but it can also deceive. Prepare well, signal wisely, and trust that help is out there." He folded his hands around the mic, a faint smile touching his lips. Around him, campers and rangers nodded, the legacy of that flash of red carried forward in every lesson learned. In the vastness of the High Sierra, the story of his survival had become a beacon, one that would guide others through the wilderness of uncertainty and hope.